Have you ever noticed how he reappears right when you seem to be doing better? When your voice is steady again, your laugh returns, and your pain is tucked neatly behind your smile. Have you asked yourself, why does he only approach when I've already healed myself? There's a profound loneliness in being the strong one. It's not a role you chose, but one that slowly formed around you. A role that others began to expect and exploit. Your strength became the space in which others could rest. But where in all of that were you allowed to fall apart? What often passes for commitment in these dynamics is not love. It is emotional convenience, a kind of calculated affection that masquerades as support, but only under specific terms, when you are whole, contained, pleasant. When your needs are small and your pain doesn't spill, then, and only then, does he return. You become the sanctuary, the peace after the storm. But no one ever asks, who held you through it? Emotional convenience is subtle. It's not always cruel or loud. In fact, it often comes wrapped in sweet gestures and comforting words, but always too late, after the crisis has passed, after the tears have dried, after you've convinced yourself once again that you can survive without being held. This dynamic creates an invisible form of reinforcement. Each time you reveal pain and he withdraws, your nervous system receives a quiet message. Vulnerability leads to abandonment. And each time he returns with praise when you're strong again, you learn, strength is the price of being loved. So you adapt. You shrink your emotional expression. You rush your healing. You stop reaching out, not because you don't need support, but because you've learned it won't come when it truly matters. And then, something even more insidious happens. You begin to wear your strength like armor, not as a conscious empowerment, but as survival. You anticipate disappointment, so you become self-sufficient. You prepare for silence, so you become emotionally fluent in isolation. You become easy to be with, because being difficult means being alone. Freud might suggest that this is not merely relationship behavior, it's a repetition of earlier emotional conditioning. Perhaps as a child, you learned that your needs were inconvenient, that expressing distress resulted in distance, not comfort, and so you learned to cope by becoming capable, composed, emotionally efficient. That script didn't begin in this relationship, it was just reinforced by it. Elle, a woman I once worked with, shared the heartbreak of this experience in one haunting sentence. He always came back, but only when I was someone he could admire. When she grieved her mother's death, he disappeared, unavailable, unreachable. But a few weeks later, when she was smiling again, functioning again, he returned with affection. "You're amazing," he told her. "I knew you'd bounce back." What he didn't know was that her bounce back came from exhaustion, not healing, from knowing that her pain would be met with absence. This is the trap. When your emotional independence becomes a condition for affection, you are no longer in a relationship. You are in an arrangement. And that arrangement depends entirely on you not being too much. The tragedy is, you begin to internalize this pattern. You stop asking who is showing up for you, and start asking what you did wrong when they don't. You stop expecting reciprocity and start perfecting performance. Ask yourself now, are you loved for who you are or for how well you hold yourself together? Do they love you, or do they love what you make possible for them? There is no shame in being strong, but there is danger in being strong alone, over and over again, without being met. Because even strength, when constantly extracted, becomes another word for depletion. And that depletion doesn't come from one dramatic event. It comes from hundreds of small moments where you needed softness and received silence instead. Where your distress was ignored, your sadness bypassed, and your return to normalcy celebrated. So how do you break this pattern? You begin by interrupting the performance. You stop fixing yourself before asking, who helps me carry what hurts? You let your pain speak before you package it. You allow yourself to be seen in your unedited truth. Tonight, write this down, not as a question but as a declaration. I am not a safe place for someone who only returns when the storm has passed. Let that be the line you no longer cross. Emotional unavailability, understanding the avoidant partner. Have you ever felt more alone lying next to someone than when you were by yourself? Has his physical presence ever made the absence of emotional intimacy even more piercing? What if the real heartbreak isn't that he's gone, but that he's there, yet you still can't reach him? This is the paradox of being with an emotionally unavailable partner. He may sit beside you. He may answer your messages. He may even whisper, "I love you." But when your feelings rise to the surface, when you need to be felt, not just tolerated, he vanishes into emotional fog. He doesn't leave the room. He just leaves the connection. Emotional unavailability is not always obvious. It doesn't always wear the face of cruelty. Often it looks like ambivalence, polite distance, just enough effort to remain relevant, not enough to create safety. It's not what he does that confuses you. It's what he doesn't do. He doesn't ask. He doesn't notice. He doesn't respond when it matters. He stays quiet just long enough for you to doubt your own expectations, and so you do what so many strong women do. You carry both your feelings and his absence. You become fluent in translating silences into assumptions. You tell yourself, he's just overwhelmed, or he shows love in different ways. But the truth lingers in your nervous system. You feel unseen, and you've been trained to accept that. Avoidant attachment isn't a flaw in character. It's a defense shaped by early relational trauma, the kind that teaches a child that closeness is threatening, intimacy is unsafe, and vulnerability is either ignored or punished. By the time that child becomes a man, he's learned how to regulate his anxiety not by connection, but by distance. And every time you reach out, emotionally, honestly, he feels the urge to withdraw. But you were likely taught the opposite. You learned that love is earned, that you must reach, perform, soothe, and never be too much. That being chosen requires emotional effort, that if someone withdraws, you must bridge the gap. This creates a brutal dynamic. You chase connection, he avoids overwhelm, and because he often stays physically present, you confuse proximity for emotional intimacy. But the space between your hearts grows wider with every silent night, every unmet need, every conversation that ends in deflection. Freud might say that what's at play here is not just incompatible behavior, it's the repetition of unresolved emotional scripts. The avoidant partner is not avoiding you. He's avoiding what intimacy requires of him. To meet you fully, he'd have to confront his own emotional history, and most of the time he's not even conscious of that. But here's the most painful part. When you continue to show up, to be the strong one, to carry the emotional weight of the relationship, he doesn't have to change. He doesn't have to confront his own gaps, because you're always bridging them. And the longer this continues, the more you silence your own needs just to maintain something that never really held you. Elle once described her avoidant partner like this: "He wasn't cold. He was kind even. But the moment I cried, it was like he disappeared behind his eyes. She stopped bringing up her struggles. She stopped expecting support. It was easier to manage alone than to face his discomfort with my pain." This is the trap of emotional self-sufficiency. You become so good at surviving the absence that you forget you ever wanted more. You confuse coping with thriving. You start believing that love means enduring, not receiving. But let me ask you, what if your emotional independence is no longer a strength but a signal that you've normalized abandonment? What if your ability to handle it all is the very thing keeping you from experiencing the depth of love you deserve? Here's where the pattern ends. You stop accommodating his avoidance. You stop interpreting silence as peace. You stop shrinking your feelings to fit someone who never asked for them, but also never made space for them. And in the quiet after the withdrawal, you begin to rebuild your relationship with yourself, not as someone who needs less, but as someone who finally knows she deserves more. Tonight, write this down and let it live in your chest. I will no longer perform emotional stillness to avoid being left. My truth deserves to be heard, not hidden, because the woman who learned to survive his silence is the same woman who now chooses her voice and walks toward the kind of love that welcomes her in her full, honest, and tender truth. The cycle of convenience, breaking free from one-sided dynamics. Do you feel like you're always the one holding the relationship together? Emotionally, mentally, even spiritually? Have you ever looked at your partner and realized, he's comfortable because I carry the weight? There is a hidden exhaustion in one-sided emotional labor. It creeps in slowly, not as an explosion but as a quiet depletion, a slow-burning fatigue that no one sees because you are so good at making everything look okay. But underneath the calm, you are aching, not because of one moment, but because of repetition, the repeated experience of giving more than you receive. This is the cycle of emotional convenience. You give care, affection, patience, presence, not because you don't have boundaries, but because you hope. You hope that if you love him well enough, he will one day meet you at the depth you offer. But instead, he takes what you give and settles into the comfort of your over-functioning. He offers just enough to keep you invested. A message after days of silence. A compliment after withdrawal. A sudden burst of affection after an argument. These moments feel meaningful, but they are not anchored in change. They are emotional breadcrumbs, delivered at intervals just long enough to maintain your confusion, your hope, your participation. This is not love. It's a psychological loop built on intermittent reinforcement, the most addictive form of behavioral conditioning. Freud would recognize this as a pattern of internalized power imbalance. It is not simply that he takes and you give. It's that you have been conditioned to accept this as your relational role. Somewhere in your history, perhaps as a child or in early relationships, you were taught that attention must be earned. That stability comes only when you work for it. And so you began to associate effort with love, caretaking with connection. You became fluent in his moods, careful with your tone, generous with your emotional capacity, even when none of it was returned. And when you did ask for more, you were told you were too demanding, too sensitive, too much. So you learned to need less, to speak less, to expect less. Elle once described her experience with chilling clarity. He didn't have to show up emotionally because he knew I would cover the gap. She told me how she kept justifying his behavior, telling herself he was stressed, busy, emotionally wounded. But underneath all the rationalization, she carried the growing ache of invisibility. I wasn't in a relationship. I was in a performance, one I had to keep perfect so he wouldn't leave. This is the essence of emotional freeloading. He benefits from your effort while offering nothing stable in return. You manage the emotional climate so he never has to step into the discomfort of real intimacy. And the cost? Your emotional depletion, your slow erasure. But here's the deeper wound. You begin to lose trust in your own needs. You start to believe that asking for reciprocity is a burden, that your desire to be held, seen, met is somehow excessive. You confuse emotional starvation with maturity. You convince yourself that not needing is a form of strength. But it's not strength. It's adaptation, and adaptation should not be mistaken for alignment. A relationship that thrives only when you are shrinking, censoring, and stretching beyond your limits is not a partnership. It's a system of emotional imbalance where one person's comfort is built on the other's silence. So how do you break the cycle? First, you tell the truth. Not to him, not yet, but to yourself. You admit that you are not okay, that the relationship does not feel reciprocal, that you are carrying more than your share, and it is costing you, emotionally, psychologically, energetically. Then you stop performing, you stop rescuing, you stop preemptively managing conflict, you stop smoothing over his disconnection. You let things break if they must, because what's breaking was never whole to begin with. And you reclaim the radical right to be met in your fullness, not just tolerated in your silence. Tonight, write this. I am no longer available for dynamics that thrive on my emotional labor, but leave me empty, because the woman who has learned to soothe others now chooses to soothe herself. And the woman who once mistook presence for partnership now knows love without effort is convenience, not commitment, and she is no longer willing to pay for someone else's comfort with her own soul. Reclaiming your emotional space, the path to self-empowerment. What if your exhaustion isn't because you're doing too much, but because you've been doing it alone emotionally for far too long? What if your silence isn't peace, but resignation? There comes a point in many women's lives, often after years of being emotionally responsible for others, when the body begins to whisper what the heart has long known. This is unsustainable. The tension in your shoulders, the fatigue behind your smile, the sighs you suppress, these are not minor inconveniences. They are symptoms of a life spent overgiving, overextending, overfunctioning, especially in relationships where reciprocity is absent. This is the hidden crisis behind emotional depletion, and it doesn't happen in a dramatic collapse. It happens quietly, over time, in the spaces where your needs were silenced to preserve someone else's comfort. Where you were the listener, the fixer, the emotional regulator, but never the one allowed to unravel. When your emotional space has been constantly occupied by tending to others, you lose connection to your own interior life. You don't stop feeling. You stop noticing what you feel. You bypass yourself so automatically that you begin to confuse numbness with strength. Reclaiming that emotional space is not selfish. It is survival, and it is sacred. One of the first truths you must accept is this: not everyone is entitled to your empathy. Not every silence must be filled with your reassurance. Not every relationship deserves the endless grace you have been conditioned to give. Many women were taught, not in words but through modeling and reinforcement, that love means managing, that intimacy means accommodation, that to be good is to be selfless, quiet, flexible. You may have heard explicitly or implicitly, "Don't upset him. Don't be so dramatic. He's doing his best." But no one ever asked if you were okay, if you felt safe, if you had room to breathe. So you learned to downplay your pain, to rationalize his neglect, to frame emotional imbalance as normal, even noble. You became a caretaker to someone who never considered the cost of your caregiving. Freud would say this pattern is reinforced through early conditioning. A young girl who learns that her feelings must be managed in isolation, or worse, punished, will often grow into a woman who prides herself on emotional independence. But that independence, while admirable, can become a cage when it's built on the avoidance of rejection. So what does it look like to reclaim your emotional space? It starts with awareness. You begin to notice where your energy goes, who drains it, who replenishes it. You ask yourself not, am I overreacting, but am I consistently unsupported? You start measuring your relationships not by how much you give, but by how they make you feel over time. And then you draw boundaries, not as walls, but as invitations for healthier relating. A boundary is not punishment. It's a statement of self-respect. It's the act of saying, I matter here too. And it's the refusal to negotiate your emotional health in exchange for someone else's comfort. L. Jace, who spent years orbiting her partner's emotional availability, once described her breaking point as a kind of quiet rebellion. She didn't scream. She didn't beg. She simply stopped over-explaining. She stopped overextending. She stopped holding space for someone who never once asked how she felt. And in that silence, she heard something profound, her own voice, whispering, enough. The path to empowerment is not a straight line. It's often a series of small acts, saying no without guilt, pausing before responding, choosing rest over explanation, allowing yourself to want more without apology. It also means facing the grief that comes with change, because reclaiming your space often means losing people who are only comfortable with your absence. It means sitting with the discomfort of being misunderstood, blamed, even vilified, especially by those who benefited from your silence. But here is the deeper liberation. When you stop rescuing others from their discomfort, you rescue yourself from emotional depletion. You step out of the rescuer's role and into your own life, not as a savior, but as a sovereign woman. Tonight, write this. I no longer abandon myself to preserve false peace. My emotional space is sacred, and I choose to protect it. Because the woman who once gave too much is now learning to give to herself first. And in that choice, one's a quiet, powerful, consistent, she finds not just recovery but rebirth. From strength to wholeness, embracing vulnerability as power. Have you ever wondered if your strength has become a disguise? Not the kind you wear proudly, but the kind you no longer know how to take off. What if the very trait that others admire, your resilience, is also the barrier between you and the kind of love you truly crave? For many women, strength became a necessity long before it became a choice. It was forged in loss, abandonment, neglect, betrayal. You learned to endure not because you wanted to, but because you had to. There was no room to fall apart, no one to catch you. And so you became your own safety net, your own therapist, your own shelter. But strength, when hardened by necessity, can become armor. And armor, while protective, is also heavy. It keeps out harm, but it also keeps out intimacy. It prevents others from seeing your softness, your needs, your fears, and the longer you wear it, the more you forget what it feels like to be held. truly held, without condition or expectation. Vulnerability, on the other hand, asks you to remove that armor, to expose what the world taught you to hide, your longings, your grief, your hope. But when every past attempt at vulnerability has been met with rejection, shame, or silence, opening up feels like a risk too great to take. So you stay strong. You keep smiling through the ache. You offer support without asking for it. You tolerate distance, delays, and emotional crumbs, not because it feels good, but because it feels familiar. The pattern becomes, if I stay capable, maybe he will stay connected. But this is not wholeness, this is survival dressed up as emotional maturity. Freud might say that what you're doing is protecting your ego, not in a selfish way, but in a deeply human way. The ego, when wounded by abandonment, learns to anticipate rejection and preemptively armor against it. And so you present strength as a shield. I don't need much. I'm fine. I'll figure it out. So yes, but beneath that, maybe even beneath your awareness, is the ache of never having been met in your need. Wholeness, however, is not about being invulnerable. It's about integrating all parts of yourself, not just the ones that look admirable from the outside. It's about honoring the part of you that is tender, scared, tired, the part of you that longs to be seen without earning it, that needs to be held without explaining why. And here's the truth. Real love doesn't just admire your strength. It meets your vulnerability with presence, not punishment. It doesn't reward performance. It invites authenticity. It says, you can fall apart here. I will not leave. But that kind of love, the one that can meet your truth, cannot enter a space where only your strength is allowed to live. So after years of being in relationships where she was praised for how independent and low maintenance she was, finally broke that pattern. She chose, in a new relationship, to be fully herself. One night, she cried without softening it. She didn't apologize, she didn't explain, and he didn't run, he didn't try to fix it. He simply stayed, held her, and in that moment she realized, this is what I've always needed. Not admiration, presence. The shift from strength to wholeness is a radical act. It requires you to stop performing wellness, to stop minimizing your need for connection, to stop believing that being loved means being easy. And that shift begins with a choice. You start speaking honestly, even if your voice trembles. You ask for what you need, even if it feels like too much. You stop dismissing your emotions as inconvenient. You stop making yourself small to keep others comfortable. Tonight, write this. I no longer need to be strong to be loved. I deserve to be met in my fullness, in my softness, my uncertainty, my humanity. Because the woman who once survived on strength alone is now choosing something richer, integration. And in that integration, strength and softness, courage and fear, power and need, she becomes whole. She no longer accepts love that only applauds her resilience. She seeks love that honors her reality. And the woman who walks forward now knows vulnerability is not the opposite of power. It is power. The quiet, unwavering kind. The kind that doesn't perform but simply is. Present, unapologetic, enough.